to the 1st of December, formally each and every year. The current season is the 1st of October to the 31st of January, with the season in Scotland starting on the 1st of September. Wild Justice wrote to DEFRA and the Northern Ireland authorities in March, but are yet to receive a substantive response. The petition has received 107,916 signatures, including 76 from the Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork constituency, demonstrating its considerable support from across our United Kingdom. There is no doubt that at present, the resident British woodcock population is not doing well. The Staffordshire Wildlife Trust do great work too in my constituency and are dedicated to protecting some of our most beautiful and natural wildlife. And woodcocks are the only species of wading bird in Britain and Ireland that is adapted to breed in woodland areas. The British Trust for Ornithology, BNO, describe it as a superbly camouflaged, with a habit of remaining motionless unless approached at very close quarters. There are two distinct populations of woodcock in the United Kingdom: a smaller breeding population, resident all year round, and a much larger overwintering population that arrives from the UK from November onwards. Arrives to the UK from November onwards, apologies, Dame Caroline. I have held meetings with those on both sides of this debate in order to ensure I make a balanced and considered points on the matter. So I was very glad to meet with Mark, Chris and Ruth from Wild Justice, who have, of course, led this petition. In addition, I spoke with Jeff Knott from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB. Both these organisations are supportive of the motion that this petition seeks to introduce. I also spoke with Andrew Hoodless and Roger Draycott from the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, GWCT, who argue that the ban is arbitrary and the decline in the woodcock population is in fact as a result of bad habitats for woodcocks and the deer population. These views are shared by Jack Abrahams from the British Association Shooting Conservation and Tim Bonner from the Countryside Alliance. They believe that parliamentary time would be better spent on debating and scrutinising the government's approach to resident deer population management or the proper management of the countryside so we can best protect British and Irish woodcocks. In 2015, the native woodcock was put on the Great Britain Red List in order to highlight its decline. Wild Justice are determined for the Secretary of State to introduce statutory measures to reduce the shooting season specifically for woodcocks. The woodcock is a magnificent species and a true symbol of the great British countryside. As chair of this debate this afternoon, Dame Caroline, I look forward to setting out to you the complex and nuanced arguments surrounding the length of the season and how best to protect the woodcock. Let me be clear. What is in no doubt is that the native British and Irish woodcock is in decline. The first breeding woodcock survey was undertaken in 2003 and estimated a breeding population of 78,000 pairs in Britain. However, a survey conducted a decade later in 2013 found that there was only 55,000 pairs in the UK, representing a significant decline of 29%. But I will now press on and highlight the arguments for both for and against the motion. I'll start by setting out the arguments made by Wild Justice and the RSPB. Wild Justice say they use the legal system to get a better deal for UK wildlife, challenge government decisions in the courts and campaign for better and stronger laws and policies. With the native woodcock breeding population in sharp decline, Wild Justice suggests that the shooting season should be reduced by pushing the start date back. This is not to end the shooting season, but simply change of when the season starts. It is vital that we stress that they are not, as I say, looking for an outright ban either of shooting woodcock, but instead are focused on shortening the shooting season to better protect the native woodcock population. Despite figures which suggest that the native population has declined drastically, the Pro-Shooting Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust estimate each year that the UK receives around 160,000. Each year that the UK has 160,000 woodcocks shot in the United Kingdom. At present, the shooting season commences on the 1st of October in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and the 1st of September in Scotland, carrying on until the 31st of January. Wild Justice's suggestion to move the start date back to the 1st of December would reduce the number of native woodcocks being shot and therefore help reverse this tragic decline in one of Britain's most recognisable birds. Wild Justice argued that the current shooting season dates compromise the native British and Irish population of woodcocks, as until December there is little to no migration of winter visitors from continental Europe and Asia. There is no difference in appearance between a woodcock from a forest in Britain than there is with a woodcock from a forest in Siberia, and as such, the proportion of British and Irish woodcocks being shot is far more significant until the winter migration takes place in the season. Therefore, the petition, which is put forward to us today, seeks to get the Secretary of State to exercise their respective power to vary the closed season for the woodcock. Wild Justice and the 107,000 signatories of this petition argue it will drastically help our native birds. Importantly, this does not require primary legislation. In Great Britain, the Secretary of State has the power to vary the closed season for woodcock. Similarly, in Northern Ireland, the Minister has the same power to vary the closed season for woodcocks there. Whilst conducting research on this important debate, as I said, I met with Jeff from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and Jeff argued that the concept of voluntary restraint, which the shooting lobby use as an sustainable rationale for the protection of the current season, is highly ineffective. Voluntary restraint is used by some shooting organisations to protect this majestic bird. Rather than require statutory measures to protect woodcocks, organisations regulate themselves and either completely prohibit shooting woodcocks or follow the guidance laid out by Wild Justice. Jeff discussed a joint statement from February 2020 in which 9 shooting organisations called for a voluntary phase out of the use of lead in ammunition within 5 years. But despite there being ostensible support for the statement, the Shot Switch research project showed that by 2022, 99.5% of pheasants for human consumption bought from retailers across the UK, from which the shotgun pellets could be recovered, had been killed using lead ammunition.
Will you give way on that?
I'm happy to give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend, and I think he's doing a very good job being fair and putting the argument across. First thing is the plural of woodcock is woodcock. There's no S, so I'm sorry to be pedantic about that, but I just thought it might be helpful. Secondly, the voluntary ban on using lead shot hasn't been completed yet, so it's inevitable that there will be some lead still used.
I'm very grateful to my
Gullis
gentleman for correcting my spelling, punctuation and grammar. It's always good as a teacher to be clued up on these things, and I've shown that I need to go back to school quite urgently. But I also want to just put the point across that was made to me that actually you would have expected a much sharper decline, and whilst the RSPB will accept to a certain extent that because of COVID and lockdown that there will be obviously lead shot that needs to be still got rid of and would have slowed down, the reality is they would have still expected a much more drastic reduction than 0.5% that we've currently seen, and therefore would argue that the point proves that the voluntary restraint isn't actually being taken very seriously by those participating, and that's why the concern for the woodcock is also shared by the Wild Justice, who would argue that despite this informal agreement, it has not been carried up forward. And in fact, in the Shooting Times, there's been openly bragging about the shooting of woodcock outside of the agreed season, which would therefore lean into this idea that there's mistrust, sadly, in the system currently. The RSPB argue that this makes it clear that voluntary restraint is ineffective on this issue, and therefore statutory measures must be enforced to protect the woodcock. In addition to the lead ammunition survey, another indicator of the shooting community's reluctance to cooperate in voluntary restraint is the article in the Shooting Times. The article in the Shooting Times, dated on the 25th of January 2023, clearly celebrates hunters celebrating the woodcock they have shot in mid-November. Woodcock shooting days are even now advertised online for dates before December. So this suggests that there is compelling evidence that woodcock shooting is not voluntarily withheld until December. And for the RSPB, this shows that there is a partial or incomplete understanding of when the appropriate time to shoot is. This is an important point of discussion, as we've already seen, and one of the key arguments against the ban made by those who are supportive of shooting is the principle of voluntary restraint means that any statutory ban is unnecessary. However, as the lead ammunition survey shows, there is little evidence to suggest that shooting organisations keep to their promises and restrain from shooting woodcock. Very happy to give way to the Honourable Lady.
You might be aware that there is an all-party group on lead ammunition, which I co-chair. You'd be very welcome to join that to pursue that angle. But I just want to say, in terms of this debate about whether voluntary approach is good enough, surely if the shooting organisations accept that they shouldn't be shooting during that period, the underlying case, the underlying principle that shooting woodcock out of season, before the 1st of December comes in, is wrong, has been absolutely established. So I don't understand what their objection would be if it would be outlawed. Sorry, I haven't really expressed that very coherently. But basically, if they've accepted that it's wrong, I don't understand why they feel that it should be allowed to go ahead if people feel like it.
I'm very
Gullis.
grateful to congratulate her on the fine work in the APPG on lead shot. And I think she just hits the nail on the head, Dame Caroline, when it comes to Mark, Chris and Ruth's viewpoint that ultimately there is already this involuntary agreement in place, which is agreed by all parties. So why would there be any objection to statutory enforcement of said shooting season? Because ultimately everyone agrees that the woodcock needs to be removed off the red list, and we need to see that population growth come back, and especially as we are working towards rewilding, improving our nature and landscape, making sure that we look after British species and actually seeing them repopulate, that ultimately there is a win for everyone in this regard. And I completely concur with the Honourable Lady that, to me, that does seem reasonable. And as someone who is not a shooter, someone who represents an urban constituency and didn't know about woodcock until volunteered to take on this debate, I would say that it just seems quite plain common sense to me that that is how this would go forward, in my own personal opinion. But of course, I do want to make sure I outline the opposition, because I'm very grateful for those who are willing to give their time to argue against, and obviously aren't able to have the privilege of standing here today. So, the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, BASC, the GWCT and the Countryside Alliance argue that climate change, natural habitats and deer population are actually the main reasons for the decline in woodcock. The British Trust for Ornithology largely agrees with this interpretation and says that reasons for the decline are unclear, but may include recreational disturbance, drying out of woodlands, increased browsing by deer, declining woodland management and maturing of new plantations. This, to the shooting organisations, means it is therefore highly unlikely that a statutory change will even make any real difference. The BASC argue that there is no evidence that shooting is responsible for either breeding range or population declines. The BASC refutes Wild Justice's notion that shooting is the primary factor in the woodcock's population struggle. First, the BASC argue that Wild Justice are wrong to claim that around 160,000 woodcock are shot each year. The BASC argue that this figure is based on the value of shooting survey from 2014, reflecting a bag estimate from 2012. Hence, rather than focus on Wild Justice's figure, we should look to the 2022 value of shooting survey, which is due to be published later this year, whereby all indicators point to a significantly lower figure, almost a decade on. And all the evidence suggests, anyway, that the vast majority of these birds come from the overwintering migrant population, which is healthy and not threatened. Of course, we must also consider voluntary restraint from the perspective of those who endorse it. Most shooters already act responsibly and do not start shooting woodcock until later in the season, until more birds migrate from the continent, going far and protecting the vulnerable UK population. In addition, many shoots explicitly forbid the shooting of woodcock, as they are aware of the vulnerability of the UK breeding population. So whilst there are examples of voluntary restraint not being followed, pro-shooting organisations argue that there is a minuscule number of breaches of the rules, which we must weigh up when coming to conclusions on this. It is important to stress that shooters argue robustly that they have a very deep respect for the magnificent species that we are discussing today, and shooters provide invaluable conservation work in the form of research as well as improvement to the habitat for both migratory and resident woodcock all over the UK. I represent 676 members of the BASC, and I have no doubt that they are dedicated to preserving this bird. And their argument is simple. It is more beneficial to address environmental problems to best protect woodcock. Furthermore, the GWCT also points out that a statutory change to the woodcock shooting season fails to consider geographical nuances. In the UK, there are no native woodcock in the southwest and Wales, for example. Therefore, should a woodcock be shot in one of these areas in mid-November, it would almost certainly be a foreign bird, especially given that native woodcock typically stay within a 30-mile radius throughout the year. Having held discussions with Andrew Hoodless from the GWCT, he believes that Wild Justice's focus on shooting risks, taking the focus away from the real issues facing our native breeding woodcock, and could disincentivise active management of woodlands, which is what the woodcock actually needs. The GWCT argues strongly that Wild Justice failed to consider some of the nuances involved in this debate on the subject, and they believe it would be more appropriate to consider a change to the shooting season once the results of the National Breeding Woodcock Survey to be repeated in 2023, 10 years after the last survey, are known. And GWCT argue that to really address breeding woodcock declines, a change to the shooting season should be considered as part of a package of measures, including targeted woodland management incentives, which would also benefit certain other declining woodland birds and butterflies. Wild Justice are missing the point on this through their failure to properly acknowledge the significant impact of the change in habitats the argument would be, and are using shooting to score political points. And while Justice have stated that they would like to see an outright ban on woodcock shooting and are using the current proposed change to the start of the season as a test of the government's commitment to wildlife conservation pro-shooting organisations have put forward. Moreover, the Countryside Alliance argue that the primary reason for the decline includes the maturing of conifer plantations and changes to management practices such as coppicing, which means there is a reduced, less diverse shrub layer and a loss of open space for woodcock to breed in. One of the Countryside Alliance's main arguments centres on the need to dedicate focus on local deer populations, and they pointed to studies which vividly illustrated the demonstrable impact that browsing by deer can have on the habitats that woodcock live in. As such, they feel parliamentary time would be best suited to debating sustainable deer management or other matters including the impact habitat degradation has on the native woodcock population and wider biodiversity. And lastly, Dame Caroline, on this particular area, it's important to outline that the importance of shooting has to our United Kingdom in terms of its economy. Research from shooting organisations suggests that shooting contributes £2.4 billion to the UK economy, and crucially, people who shoot contribute around 3.9 million working days on conservation every year. If it is game shots on farms and estates that create the revenue and the reason to invest in creating and caring for biodiverse habitats that benefit woodcock, but also many other species. This would not be the case if the land was used for commercial farming. This combination of managed woodland, predator control and biodiverse habitats are the secret to a healthy woodcock population, not the changing of the shooting season. So, as I come to conclude, Dame Caroline, it has been immensely interesting to hear other points of view. It's going to be fantastic to see colleagues here representing their different perspectives as well, and I really appreciate everyone willing to contribute to this timely debate. But before I conclude, I would like to quickly offer my own view on this matter. Ultimately, I do not see any serious argument when there's already pre-agreement between those who shoot and those who, like Wild Justice, want to see conservation work at its best, that we can't come to some statutory agreement that the shooting season take place from the 1st of December. I think when an animal is placed on a red list and is in decline, it is actually the responsibility of UK lawmakers to make sure that we protect and preserve these animals to repopulate as quickly as possible, and then, as that bird is moved off the red list, and have an open conversation about whether or not to change the shooting season once again back to the current informal agreement that has taken place. But the preservation of our wildlife is something that's really important to, I know, my constituents, although being a city, one of the greenest cities in the United Kingdom, which I'm proud to represent, and I hope that obviously I can have done justice to the petitioners today in putting forward their views across, as well as obviously being fair and balanced in putting the other side of the argument across. And as I say, I look forward to hearing what colleagues have to say, and thank you, Dame Caroline, for your time.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 619-615 relating to the open season for woodcock. Olivia Blake.
Dame Caroline, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship today, and I'd like to thank the Petitions Committee and the member for just outlining the debates around this so eloquently. Those who regularly attend debates on nature and the climate emergency will know that, like many in my constituency, I'm a great supporter of our environment and protecting species in decline. Although I'm a biomedical scientist, I am intrigued and fascinated by all life and recognise the value that our natural world offers in so many ways. And today we're here to talk about woodcocks and the woodcock. And I'm here to lend my support to the petition that 370 of my constituents signed in support. And I'd like to thank the campaigners for raising awareness of this issue, including Wild Justice and others, and bringing this forward for debate today. While the migratory population of woodcock is not declining, the native population has reduced by a horrifying 19% in the last 10 years and 29% since the 70s. We should see these figures in the context of the large-scale species decline that is characterising the twin nature and climate emergencies. Last year, Living Planet reported to find that global animal populations experienced an average decline of nearly 70% in the last 50 years. The woodcock in the UK is clearly at the sharp end of this global trend, and as the 2019 State of Nature report highlights, 41% of species in the UK have reduced in number since the 1970s, and since the year 1500, 133 species have vanished altogether. We should be doing all we can to ensure the woodcock does not join them. That should mean taking measures such as outlined in this position, moving the open season on woodcock to December to reduce the number of native birds that are shot. It should also mean proactive approaches and measures to protect and extend the habitats that support this species. As the name suggests, the woodcock inhabits woodlands, so it's vital that we do all we can to revitalise these habitats. By the end of this Parliament, the government has already set itself a target of planting 30,000 hectares of woodland per year. In 2021, they managed 13,400 trees being planted, and last year that only grew by 400 trees extra to 13,800 trees. If that current trend continues, we will obviously not reach the 30,000 hectares target per year. I'd like to ask the Minister what the government is doing to increase this figure so that they match their targets. To meet the target, we'll also need to increase capacity in our domestic nurseries, but capacity and tree planting expertise has reduced in the UK. What is the government doing in terms of not only supporting and growing domestic tree nurseries, but ensuring that we have the skills and expertise to staff those? Although we are debating nature and the woodcock, the reduction we are seeing in woodcock numbers and in species across the UK and the globe are not natural. To reverse the decline, we'll need changes in regulation and the law, but it will also need investment in green infrastructure within the UK. And in the case of the woodcock, especially our woodlands, part of the measures of our success in revitalising these habitats will be in the return of these species. I hope that 10 years' time we'll look back and see a huge growth in our domestic woodcock population. But for that to happen, we'll need measures such as this that are outlined in this petition and serious investment in the necessary skills and infrastructure to protect and grow our woodlands. That is what we need from government.
Thank you very much indeed, Caroline. And could I first thank the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North for introducing this debate in such a balanced way. And I think also might mention that probably I am to blame for one of the reasons we're here, because it was some years ago I mentioned to David Cameron the petition system in Estonia, where if a certain number of the population signed a petition, it would be debated in Parliament. So I'm very pleased that that suggestion to David Cameron, who was leader of the opposition at the time, has actually resulted in these sort of petitions coming forward. Could I put on record the fact I'm a trustee of the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, chaired so ably by our former colleague Sir Jim Pace. The Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust carries out much needed research in these areas to ensure that when decisions are made by politicians and land managers, they're based on sound scientific research, and indeed they publish the results of their research, whether or not it actually benefits some of their objectives. There's a lot of talk currently about the way that we are changing the way we manage our countryside with the Environmental Land Management Scheme, with rewilding, tree planting and general conservation front and central to government policy. But of course, where shooting takes place, this has been happening for generations. And in fact, that's had very knock-on positive effects for ecology. Indeed, 2/3 of my constituency is covered by moorland, where not only the grouse thrives, but also the lapwing, the curlew and the golden plover, because it's the management of that grouse moorland, including the burning and the predator control, that means not only that the game species can thrive, but also those other species that need that environment as well. And many of those arguments will apply also to the woodcock. Indeed, there is a situation unfolding in my patch where one of the landowners wants to plant some woodland, but because the adjacent moorland is not shot and is not gamekeepered, Natural England are worried that the predators, such as foxes, that will be in that woodland could go onto the moor and actually deplete some of those important ground nesting species that we all want to see. Now, as we've heard already, there are two populations of the woodcock, the resident and the migratory. In fact, there's been some talk about the red list. I mean, the woodcock is internationally on the red list, listed as a species of least concern with a stable population trend. In the same category, for example, as the blackbird. But of course, the resident population is under much more pressure. Around about 1.4 million migrants arrive each year, arriving a mean date about the 10th of November, and they leave in March. But the resident population is much smaller, around about 55,000 males in the spring. By the way, Dame Caroline, we count the males because they display in the spring and they're easier to spot than the females, and that results in a population around about 180,000 in the autumn. The native woodcock was actually rare or absent in the UK until the mid-19th century. Because it nests in woodland, those habitats weren't there. And it was down to lowland tree planting, some of that for encouraging game, that the birds started to build here. And in fact, in the 20th century, we saw the very large areas of conifer plantation by the Forestry Commission and others, which actually resulted in the population increasing. Now, of course, that population is declining, and there's a number of factors behind that. First of all, we cannot avoid the effect of global warming on species. We're seeing that the western limit of the woodcock, which is here in the UK, is moving to the north and the east. And in fact, in Devon and Cornwall, it is very rare. And unfortunately, global warming is having an effect. Secondly, those conifer plantations, which when they were planted were very superb environments for the woodcock, are now maturing, and there's very little opportunity for them to breed in there. We also have woodland degradation by deer, which are not conducive to woodcock breeding, and also predation from raptors and other predators, in particular some of the birds of prey. And I saw 14 buzzards in the sky in one place last summer. So it's great news that we're getting more raptors and birds of prey, but they do predate on some of these ground nesting species. So currently we have a shooting season between the 1st of October and the 31st of January in England and Wales. And as suggested by many of the shooting organisations, we have a voluntary deal in place and to delay until November. And they're very high levels of compliance. I know we've heard some figures bandied around, but figures I've seen from the British Association of Shooting Conservation is that there's 97% plus compliance with those. In terms of numbers shot, we've heard already from my honourable friend that the figures that are being bandied around are based on 2012 shooting figures published in 2014. So I think it would be important to wait until we see the figures published this year on the 2022 figures. So the proposal in the petition, I believe, will have little effect on the resident population. Only around 2% of birds shot are not migratory, and sustainable levels of shooting and the voluntary delay of shooting are the way forward, at least until we have more data. But what we can actually do, I think, to encourage more woodcock is to continue to have active habitat management, and part of the changes in the way we support farmers will help that, and in particular looking at more open woodland. Secondly, we need to have better predator control. Foxes, mustelid such as stoats and feral cats are actually predating upon our native species. And actually, we'd like to see more game being eaten, particularly venison, because it's the effect of unprecedentedly high numbers of deer in our country that are actually causing some of the degradation of the habitats. Now, I've not eaten woodcock myself, but I hear it has a very high reputation. But I feel the more shooting farms and estates that we can have, the more land managers then will be engaged in the conservation work that we need to rebuild our woodcock population, our native woodcock population. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
First of all, guys, say what a pleasure it is to speak in this debate. I thank the honourable gentleman for setting the scene so very well and hopefully a balanced way. I think his understanding of the subject matter has been enlightened by his hard work when he went into looking at it. It's well known, Madam Chair, that I'm a country sports enthusiast, and within the very heart of that title is a need to be a conservationist. Those two, in my opinion, are mutually inclusive, and I want to perhaps just focus upon that in the short time that I have to speak. I can also declare an interest, Madam Chair, as a member of the British Association of Shooting and Conservation, a member of the Countryside Alliance Ireland, and also a member of Sports Ireland as well, a member of the Ulster Farmers Union, and the landowner. All those things I make the point because those are the things that I'm involved with, but I also want to do that for a purpose. On my farm, where we've planted some 3,500 trees, we have created the habitat, the very habitat that woodcock wants. And not just for woodcock, but indeed for all birds, for pheasants, for pigeons, for songbirds. The yellowhammer, a bird that was almost at the lowest numbers ever, has now been has a place on our farm, and indeed all the farms round about us, and Calvert's farm and in Rosemount and Ballymolter, because the landowners, all those who shoot, by the way, have made it their job to create a habitat that helps the birds to thrive. On my early walk on Sunday morning, I've never seen, Madam Chair, as many songbirds as I saw on Sunday morning. It was one of the most phenomenal sights that I've seen for a long time. It tells me, Madam Chair, that those involved in conservation, those who contribute to conservation, are the ones that are creating the very habitat that we want to see in place. Shooting contributes some 2.4 billion to the UK economy per annum, and people who shoot contribute 3.9 million work days on conservation every year. That's the equivalent of 16,000 full-time jobs, full-time conservation jobs, that is, by the way, conservation jobs. Some of these funds in the conservation days are put towards the management of land for woodcock, as we do and my neighbours do as well. I agree with Countryside Alliance and the BASC, who have highlighted that without the financial incentive, shoot owners and managers would not contribute to the management of their habitat, fuelling fears that the native population would drop. I have many friends in the constituency that I live in, Madam Chair, and they go woodcock shooting every Saturday during the season. Not every Saturday, but whenever the winter comes in, because there's no sense in doing it otherwise. They start in December. They do that because that's what they do. Now, they come back and I always ask them how to get on the day, and they come back and they tell me, we put up 20 or maybe 25 woodcock a day, we shot 1 or we shot 5. I would suggest, now, they're good shots, by the way, it's not that they're bad shots, but just to say that the habitat, that's very nature, is usually very compact. Therefore, the birds are quick and fast, and the nature of the terrain means that you only get a glimpse of a bird and then it's away. But they exercise control. Let's give some credit to those who do those things. We don't need a petition to tell us what to do. You know, let's be honest. We can do those things already. We can make those contributions, and we're doing that. The global population of woodcock, some 10 to 26 million, is stable. The UK hosts 1.4 million winter migrants, according to the RSPB and BTO, with peak arrival during November and departure in late March. Data indicates, Madam Chair, that the winter migrant population is increasing. So there's more woodcock coming to the country than what there's ever been in the past. Woodcock were rare or absent as breeding birds, facts, until the mid-19th century. They were never here in those numbers as a home breeding until then. And then when extensive planting of fruits, lowland coverts, and then in the 20th century, conifer plantations led to an increase in numbers. The habitat that the conservationists, the landowners, the farmers do, has created the very habitat to encourage woodcock. Give credit to those who do that. There's currently a resident British population of 55,000 male woodcock in spring, equating to about 180,000 individuals in autumn. The UK breeding population is estimated to decline by 29% in 10 years. The reasons for this decline, and I'm going to say what the Honourable Gentleman said in the second part of his speech, very important, others will say this as well, but it's important to put it on record, including the maturing of conifer plantations and changes to management practice such as coppicing, which means there's a reduced, less diverse shrub layer and a loss of open space for woodcock to breed in. So the over population of deer, the change that there's been in forestry habits has also contributed to this as well. For obvious reasons, woodcock have traditionally been shot after the main body of migrants arrive. And there is now, this is something we haven't been told to do it because we already do it. There is now a voluntary constraint in place for woodcock not to be shot before the 1st of December. There is no evidence that any significant harvest of birds has been taken before that data or that date, and no evidence that shooting is a cause for the decline in our resident population. Given that shooting does not take place to any significant degree before the 1st of December, and the current harvest of migrant woodcock is clearly sustained, there is no need, I believe, Madam Chair, for regulatory change. Many shoots across the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland already have a policy. The Honourable Gentleman who spoke before me said it. I'm aware of it because many should say woodcock, they give you your rules before you shoot in the day. It's pheasants, no lowland game and no woodcock. So they already do that, and I think it's important that the sporting groups and the shooting groups recognise the importance of woodcock and exercise control and protection. It's perhaps into the RSPB and the BTO should take note. Extensive research has been carried out by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust into this area. Ongoing research includes their habitat for breeding woodcock in England and Wales. The open season for woodcock, during which it is lawful for them to be shot, is from the 1st of October to the 31st of January. The GWCT research highlights that the main reason for the decline is a change in their habitat. I put this on record because it's very important we say this. There are numerous reasons for this change. The maturity of the aforementioned planted woodland is seen as being the largest contributor. Rising deer numbers are also of concern due to their excessive browsing of vegetation, young shrubs and sapling trees, and disturbance of woodcock and habitat area. This is increasing the fragmentation of woodlands as well as changing the UK woodland structure. There is therefore, Madam Chair, with respect, no evidence that shooting has had a detrimental impact on the woodcock population or that changes to the existing season are necessary. So I would fully support what the British Association of Shooting and Conservation and the Countryside Alliance have called for. Continued support for a voluntary restraint for woodcock not to be shot before the 1st of December with no demonstrated need for regulatory change. You don't need to change it if everyone who's involved are already contributing to that policy. However, I would also call for further research into woodcock populations and solutions to habitat loss to support and to increase the native breeding population. I conclude with this, Madam Chair. Our woodcock are a treasure, and proper management can and should be done inclusively with the country sports enthusiasts, with the BASC, with the Countryside Alliance, with those at the CLA as well, with landowners, with those who have a love for the habitat, love for the birds. At the same time, is there anything wrong with harvesting a few to eat? I've had a few of them over my years. They're quite tasty. I've enjoyed them. I would say I'd rather have a pigeon, but that's by the way. But woodcock are a bird of some taste. And I asked the Minister to consider very seriously the best way forward to replenish and indeed to restore the numbers. Madam Chair, thank you so much.
Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. I think it's important for me to start my contribution with a little bit of constituency context. I represent a constituency in North West London, which is probably best known for being a suburban area, but we have more than 80 farms. We have a number of very important habitats, in particular for bird life, in Mad Bess Woods and Ruislip Woods. We have significant numbers of members both of the British Association of Shooting and Conservation and also the RSPB. And we're home to Holland and Holland, a well-known shooting ground which people who enjoy clay pigeon shooting and perhaps go on to practice for shooting birds use on a regular basis. And having had the opportunity to enjoy both the hospitality of the British Association of Shooting and Conservation and the All-Party Parliamentary Group of Shooting and Conservation, and also to read the very helpful and regular briefings that have come from the RSPB and other organisations with an interest over the years, it seems to me that this is one of those very important debates that goes to the heart of many of the issues that Parliament and us as members of this Parliament need to consider when looking not just at the issues that face the woodcock population in the United Kingdom, but also many of the other issues that face human-animal relations in so many different ways. I was originally a member of the RSPB's Young Ornithologists Club many, many years ago, and certainly I'd like to place on the record my thanks in particular to the noble Lord Randall, who has a huge interest in bird life and has been an influence in my thinking in this matter. It seems to me, when we look at the various different briefings that members of Parliament have received on this issue, and also the views that were set out in the petition itself, that there are a number of issues that we need to consider. It's very clear, indeed, that climate change is having a very significant impact on the breeding habitats of wild birds around the world, and especially in respect of migratory species. We need to consider what responsibilities our government has, not just on what we're able to do here within the United Kingdom, but what influence we are able to bring to bear in international forums in order to try and secure and improve the provision of those habitats so that birds that are migratory and also those who are domestic to the United Kingdom are able to thrive. And I was very struck reading in particular the briefing from the Countryside Alliance, which set out a great deal of the history, which a lot of which has been referred to by other members already speaking. especially highlighting that the habitats which are so important for our woodcock population in the United Kingdom largely derive from environments that were created specifically over the years for those people who are wishing to create an environment suitable for pheasant shooting. And I think it's been a consistent issue in the debates relating to any proposed restrictions on the shooting of animals in the United Kingdom. And I have to say personally, I've never shot a living creature for fun. I'm quite happy to eat game that's been shot. But it's been a consistent theme that's arisen through all of those, which is the nature of the balance between those who manage environments that are crucial for species, but who are doing so because of farming or because of, in this case, shooting for pleasure, and the need to restrict behaviour which either goes against the law or which has a long-term and negative impact on the well-being of those particular species. And what I found very striking in that Countryside Alliance briefing was the evidence which shows that the shooting of animals, the income that's derived from that, and the management of those habitats as a result, has been a long-term benefit to the species that we are talking about here today, and also species that we've debated in previous discussions in response to previous petitions and wider spread public concern. So whilst I completely understand the views of a good many of my constituents in particular who will be most persuaded by the views of the RSPB, it does seem to me we need, at a governmental level, to balance that with the overall environmental and wildlife impact that any further restrictions would introduce. And as a consequence, it seems to me, when we do balance those two things, I very much agree with the member for Strangford, which is that the evidence so far shows that the voluntary actions which have been undertaken have been beneficial. That is an appropriate first step for those of us who have concerns about ensuring that this issue is addressed in the long term. But it is a matter which government clearly needs to keep an eye on and ensure that the responses that we are seeing from government in terms of any further regulation, some of which may well be appropriate, and I think the work that's been done with different organisations on the move from lead to steel shot is an example of how cooperation, in fact, can lead to a much better outcome in terms of animal welfare and environmental welfare than the alternative of seeking regulation, which doesn't perhaps fully consider the impact, in particular, on the incomes which support that wildlife and habitat management, that we need to make sure that that sense of cooperation is one which is continued. So, Madam Chair, that being the case, it seems to me that I'm not convinced by the evidence that's been presented that further regulation is justified at this time, nor am I convinced that it would be beneficial to the animal species, both woodcock and other creatures that are part of this overall both economic ecosystem and wildlife ecosystem. And therefore, it is my view that I very much agree, as the member for Strangford outlined, that we should continue to monitor this, but that the status quo as proposed is one which represents an appropriate balance between the interests of birds, the interests of the economy, the interests of people who wish to enjoy shooting as part of their day-to-day life in our countryside.
Sir Bill Wigan.
Thank you very much, Ben Carroll. I thought my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent North, forgive me, put the arguments extremely well. And he was very fair and very honest and open, and I thought that was helpful. I'm very fond of woodcock, and I must just draw members' attention to my registered members' interest. They're the only birds with binocular vision, which means that when they fly, they can see where they're going, which is why you get an extraordinary flight pattern, particularly in the evening as the light fades. Now, I'm also delighted that Wild Justice are accepting the value of shooting and conservation. But I did think that it was an organisation that wasn't terribly happy with the law on raptor control. And therefore, I'm not sure that bringing in more laws is necessarily going to make them any happier. 10% of the woodcock that arrive in the UK, of the 1.6 million, 10% are shot. Most of those must be migrant woodcock. Therefore, why is the wild population in the rest of the world not declining? So I did a little bit of maths. Now, I hope the House will forgive me if I get it wrong. But according to the statistics from this debate, there are 55,000 male woodcock in the UK in the spring. So that means there are probably 55,000 female woodcock in the UK in the spring, of which they will lay 4 eggs. Woodcock lay about 4 eggs, and if they hatch, that's 220,000 chicks, of which 220,000 eggs, of which 2/3 are likely to hatch. That's 145,000 woodcock chicks hatching in the UK every year from the current existing population. And yet only 18,000 of these get shot. So if you are worried about woodcock, and I'm sure many of the people listening to this debate are, because they're beautiful birds, then what has happened to all the rest of those chicks? And the answer must be that the problem is not shooting. The problem is habitat, and it always will be with these particularly wonderful birds. You probably won't ever see one if you go for a walk in the countryside, because their camouflage is fantastic. If, on the other hand, you take your dog for a walk, then your chance of seeing it goes up dramatically. And that is why my suspicion is that the people who are wandering around the countryside are perhaps unwittingly doing far more damage to the 145,000 woodcock chicks that never make it to adulthood, seemingly. So the next thing is, if both sides of the argument agree that woodcock are special and shouldn't really be shot until mid-November or the beginning of December, why do we need to legislate? We need to legislate when things go wrong, not when things are going right. And I think that people, by and large, haven't thought about what punishment they would like to see for somebody who shoots a woodcock at the end of November. At the moment, if you shoot a raptor, you can spend up to 5 years in prison. The law is extremely tough. I don't believe that 1 second while Justice is suggesting that. I think what it wants to do is put more pressure on the shooting community as much as possible. This is a community that is regulated more than anybody else, and rightly so. If you have guns, then you have to fulfill the criteria necessary to be allowed to have those weapons, and that is a rare privilege, but it's also heavily licensed, and therefore this is just another way of attacking it. So I would urge the House not to change the law on any of this, but if the government is minded to do so, then let's have some proper changes. Let's have a longer shooting season for pheasants, which aren't endangered at all. Let's have a longer period for catching up after the shooting season. Let's allow shooting on a Sunday. Let's stop people roaming around when there's shooting going on. And most of all, let's have a 10-year shotgun certificate, because now we are looking at people's medical history and the GPs are having to check people's mental health. So much progress has been made on protecting the public. Bringing people back to pay again and again wastes police time, it costs a lot, and it's completely unnecessary. So if we're going to change the laws on shooting season, then let's have a proper debate and change all the ones that need altering. Thank you.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Dame Caroline. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I will not take too much time of the Chamber this afternoon as repetition, as I was reminded as Timmy Mallet joined me at a charity event in my constituency yesterday, can bring that famous foam hammer coming down on one's head. But the point I really want to make, that builds on the arguments, particularly from my honourable friend for North Herefordshire, honourable friend for Scarborough and Whitby, honourable friend for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and honourable friend for Strangford, is this question of why. Why do we need to legislate for something, as my honourable friend before me said, that isn't actually a problem? The shooting community shoots up and down the land, and I fully accept there are 1 or 2 irresponsible shoots. There are 1 or 2 shoots that we do need to clamp down on, the sort of shoots that bury the birds afterwards rather than putting them in to the food chain. But the vast majority of shoots are entirely responsible, are entirely focused on, yes, shooting the birds, getting them into the food chain, and more than everything else, conservation, looking after our countryside, ensuring those habitats are there, not just for woodcock, but for every species you could care to imagine. And it is very clear from the statistics that have already been quoted in this chamber this afternoon, with a very high rate of compliance on that, shoots up and down the country are not shooting woodcock until after the 1st of December, as it is. And so with a statute book that is ever expanding in the United Kingdom, I put it to honourable and right honourable members that there is no good reason to add to that statute book yet further. Shooting in the United Kingdom, as has already been quoted, is a massive net benefit to our economy. It provides many thousands of jobs. But the shooting community, as is clearly evidenced through the Aim to Sustain coalition involving BASC, the Countryside Alliance, the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and many, many more, are engaged in that voluntary transition from lead to steel shot. Indeed, for many shoots, for many game dealers, it won't take the meat unless it has got British Game Assurance accreditation. And part of that accreditation is that the birds are shot with steel and not lead. This voluntary transition is leading to a much sounder, a much more sustainable shooting in the United Kingdom. And I think the longer it is left to that voluntary, and I stress that word voluntary transition, then the future of shooting, not just to the economy, but to the benefits of getting more game meat into the food chain, is all for the better. And I do say, in passing, I think it is often overlooked and forgotten that game meat is often healthier, certainly a better protein, than many of the meats we all buy on the shelves of the supermarkets, and it should be encouraged that more people eat more game. And I'm very encouraged, certainly by the BGA's ability to, or success in getting more game meat into the National Health Service and served in hospital wards as that healthy protein I have just said it is. So, Dame Caroline, we must ask ourselves this question. What good would it do to put another piece of legislation on the statute book? What would it actually achieve? Would it actually change anything on the ground? And the answer to that can only be no. As others have said, with between 1.4 and 1.6 woodcock migrating to the United Kingdom on an annual basis, the IUCN Red List clearly lists the woodcock of a species of least concern, with a stable global population trend. This is not a bird that is about to die out. This is not a bird on the precipice of extinction. And it is, as I mentioned earlier, actually the shoots themselves and farmers up and down the land that look after those habitats that sustain all of these species that we care so much about. And I think there is no question, whilst this particular petition looks at very specific dates around the shooting season, that there are those out there that want to stop shooting altogether. They want to stop the British public shooting the game and, more importantly, eating that healthy, nutritious source of food. But there is a reality that underpins it. If that mission were to be successful, and that we no longer ate game, that we no longer shot game, I believe it to be a sort of fantasyland politics, that suddenly that would lead to a massive growth in the population of woodcock or any other species, that somehow the deer will suddenly neatly pat down the soil around the newly planted sapling instead, or that the predatory bird would bring down a tasty worm and gift it to the woodcock. I would certainly give way.
Does he agree with me that even the RSPB understand the importance of predator control? And indeed, in 2018, they controlled 598 foxes, 800 crows, and indeed they also control barnacle and Canada geese to protect terns and avocets. So they understand the importance of managing the countryside in the way that gamekeepers have done for generations.
I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend. He is spot on that point. If you just take the deer population in Buckinghamshire right now, it is completely out of control. It is doing damage to farmland, to habitats, to the safety of biodiversity across the county, left, right and centre. And of course, foxes and other predatory animals do enormous damage to our wildlife. And that is the point that I was really building up to, that these factors are so much more important in the decline of the native species. And if you take shoots out of the equation, if you take people with that interest who have the passion for conservation out of the picture, then the habitats are only going to get worse. They are not going to get better. So I disagree respectfully with the petitioners that this is a problem that needs legislation. Conservation is inherent to the shooting community in the United Kingdom. And if we see shooting decline, if we see more and more restrictions that are unnecessary put upon the shooting community, actually species will go into a much worse decline.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you very much, Dame Caroline, for chairing this debate. I want to thank my honourable friend from the member for Stoke-on-Trent North on securing the debate. The protection of nature and biodiversity is something that my constituents know I take a great deal of interest in. I'm also a serving member on the Environmental Audit Select Committee. And I think that this afternoon I'm probably going to disagree with many of my colleagues on what they have said. Now, I wanted to speak on the debate really for two reasons. As a Member of Parliament for North Norfolk, firstly, my constituency had the second highest numbers of signatures on the petition, 602. So a great number. And also Norfolk is one of the many places in the UK where woodcock are known to breed. Now, this is probably likely due to the vast swathes of woodlands, and as the breeding population of woodcock is stationary and seeing large declines in population numbers, it's only right that I think that we should look at the limit on the shooting season that's being discussed here this afternoon. Now, indeed, for those of us who are present and who watched BBC's Winter Watch, I suspect Mr. Packman probably did, who had presented it himself, they will know that Norfolk featured very heavily. It was intriguing to see that the sheer variety of migratory birds the UK sees over the winter period, and indeed woodcock numbers, they do swell to over 1 million as their European visitors migrate here for the winter. However, Dame Caroline, that species decline is still noticeable and it is worrying, because migratory numbers swelling with our own indigenous birds are actually disguising the real reality of the situation. Now, the shooting season starts before these migratory birds arrive, often leaving the resident and breeding birds to be shot at the beginning of the season. Now, woodcock are a red list species. The decline in the breeding population that remains in the UK once the migratory cousins move on, we have seen is severe. And according to the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, there is currently a breeding population of approximately 55,000 pairs from the last roding counts in 2013. And I'm sure that we'll all be interested to see the new data set released later this year. But even so, with up to 100,000 birds in an annual woodcock shooting bag, it is not an unreasonable estimate that the number of woodcock will have seen another quite dramatic decline, in my view. Now, speaking personally, I don't actually see a particular reason why we have to shoot these birds. I have gone shooting myself in the past, and bearing in mind the suit I'm wearing this afternoon, you'll not be surprised to hear that. And I've obviously lived in a rural area all my life. And on the shoots that I went on, they were responsible. When woodcock were having a bad season, we didn't shoot them. And guess what? Nobody batted an eyelid. It wasn't a problem. So I do understand the shooting season. I do understand the shooting of game, particularly pheasants, but they are shot to be eaten, and it is an important part of the rural countryside life. And that key distinction, I think, is important here, because pheasants, for instance, in comparison to woodcock is a bird that is reared. They are wild birds, woodcock. They're distinctly beautiful birds. And pheasants, much of the population, 3/4 in fact, is released and reared for shooting. So with this in mind, it is clear that game birds intended to be shot have a greater chance of their population levels to be maintained in order to sustain shooting, and are actually a real food source. Woodcock are not reared. They're not a substantial food source. They're not a pest. And it is clear that the breeding population is in decline. Now, as many of the members have said, yes, I agree, it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the decline in suitable habitat is also something to take into consideration. And I do note that regional variations on sustaining woodlands may be a factor in the disturbance of these birds. However, in order for the UK to protect and to allow the resident and breeding woodcock numbers to thrive, there should be some active initiative in supporting, I think, this red list species. And that's the point I'm making. It is a contributing factor to try and help the birds. So as I end, I just want to make sure that I place on record that I'm pleased that the North Norfolk Forest Plan will provide 1,249 hectares of woodland, both coniferous and deciduous, by 2028, which will help to protect, maintain and enhance priority habitats and species. Additionally, it's positive to see the Government, Forestry England, as well as local authorities push towards a long-term vision for trees and woodlands. These will have enormous benefits on biodiversity, species recovery and climate change. However, it will naturally take time to implement, and a long-term and lasting solution is something that will always be something that takes more time than we always consider. So yes, in summary, looking to the short term rather than those long-term ambitions is something that we can do now to prevent the further decline of resident and breeding woodcock on our own shores right now. And I do believe that limiting the shooting season for woodcock can be a decent step to consider in the right direction. Thank you.
Alex Sable.
Thank you, Dame Caroline. And I'd like to thank the member for Stoke North for leading the debate and making such a comprehensive and well-balanced speech. This has been a very well-informed debate with views, a wide range of views. I have to admit, I've not had much time to prepare for this debate, as I've only just returned from Ukraine yesterday. The Eurasian woodcock, which today's debate is all about, can be found from Odessa to the Belarusian border and from Lviv to the Donbass, which ties today's debate to my journey last week, where I led an aid convoy with members from Torbay, Cardiff North and Blackpool South, from the UK through France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Poland and finally Ukraine. Members might wonder why I'm saying this, but we may find woodcock migrating through the exact same route myself and the other members took last week, giving us a rare insight into the life of the Eurasian woodcock and its pattern of migration, and the habitats it lives in, and actually the disruption that the war in Ukraine is making on bird populations. BirdLife states, aerial bombing, use of drones, artillery shelling and all other existing types of ground combat mine destroy not only settlements, all the infrastructure, but also the natural environment. It's safe to assume that military actions will significantly affect the state of bird populations in Ukraine. Dame Caroline, I don't want to stretch your patience. I'll return to the subject of the petition debate today on the open season for woodcock. The UK has two types of woodcock, resident and breeding woodcock. These woodcock breed in the British Isles and are largely sedentary. And migrant woodcock that spend the winter in the UK, return to northern and eastern Europe to breed, which I think I've expanded on enough. I've spent the morning looking at woodcock, and they're a striking bird. They have feathers of various shades of brown, including chocolatey brown and striking chestnut brown, with a long, thin, sharp beak and an unusually deep black eye. They're a nighttime bird. They eat worms, beetles, spiders, caterpillars, fly larvae, and small snails. They breed in the spring and summer and put on quite a display, flying in big circles at dusk, creaking and grunting as they go. The reason we're here today is actually quite simple. The UK population is declining and does have IUCN red list status, although it has been made, the point's been made that overall they don't, but the UK population has that status. A national survey, collaboration between the Gaming and Wildlife Conservation Trust and the British Trust for Ornithology, is conducted every 10 years. The last survey in 2013 found 55,000 males, and it's perceived the numbers have since declined. Migratory woodcock are much more numerous and arrive here in early December. They swell the population considerably, and data from GWCT shows that around 8% of shot woodcocks are resident, with the remaining 92% migratory. The request of this petition, the start of the shooting season, be delayed from October the 1st, September 1st, Scotland, to the 1st of December. The data is clear that any woodcock shot in this early season will be resident woodcock, which are clearly threatened. And I just want to thank my honourable friend from Sheffield Hallam for excellently expanding on these points and the reasons why this is happening. And there is generally agreement from everyone that this early shooting shouldn't happen. The point of dissent, whether it should be voluntary or mandatory. It's clear that moving the shooting season will protect resident birds and ensure they're protected through the all-important breeding season. We'll see what impacts this would have on breeding population figures. This year's survey will also prove invaluable data. It's been 10 years since the last one. The British Association of Shooting and Conservation said, the shooting community has placed a voluntary moratorium on shooting woodcock until the 1st December to ensure the protection of resident woodcock and focus shooting on migrant visitors. Whilst the RSB has stated the RSB supports the call for an alteration to start the woodcock hunting season to the 1st December as an emergency precautionary measure to reduce the probability that a shot woodcock originates from the threatened UK breeding population, now that species are red listed in Britain and Ireland. We see this as a proportionate measure in the context of the wider climate and nature emergency and declines in the UK breeding woodcock population. Given bird conservation groups and shooting groups seem to agree on the threat to the resident population need for a shorter season, does the Minister agree there does seem to be a lot of merit in the RSBP's proposal of a temporary measure on these lines and should be considered to allow the full impact of a later start to be properly studied and assessed? This temporary measure would have a positive impact on resident woodcock and would satisfy all the stakeholders and give us a chance to pause and do what we can to protect those resident woodcock. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dame Caroline. It is a real pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, I think, for the first time in this hall. And also, I think it's been an incredible pleasure to talk about the species, the woodcock, in such detail that I've certainly never done previously before being a Member of Parliament for over 6 years. But I am very pleased to say that in the Lake District where I live, we do have woodcock. Although reading the brief this morning as I was travelling down on the train, I have to say I never realised that they were largely nocturnal. So I think we've all learned a tremendous amount about the woodcock, and they are indeed a beautiful bird with a particularly distinctive long beak, which is used for their foraging, typically of earthworms. And I think all members who have spoken have recognised the decline of woodcock, but also nature more widely. So I'd like to begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Stoke-on-Trent, Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork, for opening this debate, giving us reason to discuss this subject, but also to Wild Justice for their campaigning on the matter, and of course to the 108,000 people who have taken an interest and their time to demonstrate the conservation of the woodcock. 142 of those signing the petition were my constituents from Copeland. But there are wider issues to consider as well, and I want to talk through some of those aspects of the need to improve our environment, as set out in the recently published Environmental Improvement Plan, all 262 pages across 10 goals, where we go into detail to discuss some of the measures that we will be taking to halt the decline of nature by 2030, based on 22 baselines, and also to increase its abundance. And it's definitely things like increasing the tree canopy cover to 16.5%. It's about improving water quality, air quality, soil, restoring our peatlands, and also improving and protecting on hedgerows, because they are absolutely vital. Just some of the measures detailed in the Environmental Improvement Plan: also creating 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat, and having a much better understanding of the over 4,000 hectares of triple SIs we have, covering over 4,000 triple SI sites covering over 1 million hectares of land. It is all set out in that document, and it builds on the Environment Act as well. But in response to this particular debate, we are working with Natural England as the lead minister. I'm working very closely with Natural England, and they're currently reviewing all of the evidence, and we will make a decision which will be science-led after that. But I do want to reflect on members' contributions today. I think in particular the members, my right honourable friend, the member for Scarborough and Whitby and Strangford and also North Herefordshire and Buckingham have all talked about the value of game. Now, I eat a predominantly plant-based diet, but I do also eat meat. And when I'm choosing which meat to eat, I much prefer to eat the meat that has come from an animal that has been reared locally, ideally Cumbrian, and actually I do enjoy game meat because I'd much prefer to eat the meat from an animal which has had some time in the wild. And I think one of the real priorities for me in DEFRA is understanding how we can make that supply chain easier for people to purchase game meat, in particular venison. We've never had as many deer, but it's not particularly easy to buy venison meat, nor is it particularly easy to sell that meat at the moment, and it's certainly not widely available in the canteens of our public services, yet it is a low-fat, high-protein, nutritious meat in abundance, and I think there would be multiple benefits for sustainability in us making progress on that mission. In terms of today's debate, I know that organisations such as the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust are playing a really important, much appreciated role, as has been discussed today. And I read with interest their 35-page Conserving Our Woodcock Game leaflet, and I acknowledge the research that has been undertaken, and most crucially, their very clear message, which is, don't shoot woodcock before the 1st of December. It couldn't be clearer, Dame Caroline. And the reason for that is that the likelihood will be you will be shooting the native woodcock, because the migratory woodcock starts to head over, perhaps late October, November, but certainly more likely in December as the temperature drops in other parts of Europe. And that is why they set that very clear recommendation and message to their members and others. The more abundant migratory woodcock population is less likely to arrive into the UK until early December, and so avoiding shooting the UK's limited native, resident breeding birds is really important. That is the clear ask from my honourable friend. And I think other members here today, I don't think there's any dissent on that matter. The dissent is perhaps whether to legislate or not. And that decision will be made on the basis of science and once we have the assessment from Natural England.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will, of course, give way.
So she will have noticed the comments on climate change, and therefore, before setting anything in legislation, shouldn't she bear in mind the flexibility that we'll need as the climate changes?
Minister. My honourable friend, as ever, makes a valid point, and all of those considerations will be taken into account before making any decisions. But I do think, as all members across this House have stated, the more urgent matter is actually how we improve the habitat, how we improve the foraging, how we really consider not just the preservation, conservation of the woodcock, but so many other species, and that is also detailed in the Environmental Improvement Plan. In conclusion, Dame Caroline, I've already set out that Natural England will be undertaking that study. Our decision on what to take forward will be based on the science. But in addition to the Environmental Improvement Plan I've set out, I would like to draw members' attention to the huge changes we're making with ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Schemes. We are moving away from the Common Agricultural Policy, which did little to incentivise innovation or improve productivity on farms and in food production, to instead environmentally based stewardship incentive across countryside stewardship and also sustainable farming incentive and the landscape recovery. And those three measures across 70% of the land in England, because that is what is found, will have a tremendous impact on the conservation of the woodcock, but also many other species on the red list and conservation more generally, biodiversity in this country. And is that, Dame Caroline, that I would like to end on, and thank you for your time in this debate.
Thank you. Jonathan Gullis, would you like to sum up?
Thank you very much, Dame Caroline. I think it's been a really good debate, one of those things that maybe doesn't get televised on the big screen enough to actually see the quality of debate, discussion, stats and facts that have been laid bare. I want to thank all members for contributing their different ideas. The member for Sheffield Hallam, obviously talking about her 370 constituents who signed the petition, and the tree nurseries that she was spotting. Actually, it was something that was brought up by Wild Justice when they were talking about the fact that we only have about 13% of forestry land, whereas in compared to France is over 30%, and this is actually something that is certainly part of a wider strategy that we need to look at and tackle in order to not only create the breeding ground for woodcock, but also to actually just improve our natural wildlife as well. The Honourable Member for Scarborough obviously was making his fair point about the red list internationally, about this being a bird that internationally is not at risk, but of course, you know, Wild Justice would point out, fairly so, that we're talking specifically about the native woodcock and the decline in that species, which is why this 1st of December date is wanted. But I do absolutely respect and understand that this is not an issue that is being faced in other parts outside of our United Kingdom. The Honourable Member for Strangford, whose 3,500 trees, if I heard him correctly, being planted on his own farmland. You know, a doughty champion of Strangford. They couldn't find a better representative, and I'm mindful of the time because I know that the Honourable Gentleman, and this is important to him, but I know for the constituency and the people of Northern Ireland that he serves, at 6:30 he has some very big work decisions to be making in the future, and I obviously want to make sure he and his colleagues in the Democratic Unionist Party have the space and time that the Prime Minister has offered to discuss the Northern Ireland Protocol negotiations that have come forward today. But I thought his explanations were very fair and very balanced about the conservation work that he has undertaken, that his community undertakes in the woodland and in the farmland that they look after, and that these are, you know, that shooters are conservationists. They do care because they obviously, yes, have their sport, but at the same time want to see their area protected. The Honourable Member, as always, from Ryswick, Northwood and Pinner, for his very balanced and, I think, views, and is someone I always fear having to try and follow in a debate, so I was glad to go in front of him on this occasion. But I think it was fair to lay out his arguments. I think the my right honourable friend for North Herefordshire, you know, is someone who is far more years and experience in this regard, in this topic area, than I. And I do think that he has outlined fairly a challenge to the department, that if change is going to come and we're going to actually introduce a statutory instrument to force the 1st of December, there has to be a wider strategy, particularly with deer as well. And I think that that would bring about at least fairness and balance for both sides to have it, because clearly climate change is having its impact, clearly natural habitat as well. I think it would be blind of us to try and pretend otherwise. My honourable friend for Buckinghamshire for outlining, again, the overwhelming majority of shooters, I think, are responsible folk and do take you know, shooting seriously and do try and follow. But sadly, there are always that minority who take advantage, who sometimes seek to go further than they should do. And therefore, sometimes that's why we have to legislate, to actually try and make sure that boundaries are felt. And then, obviously, the honourable member for North West Norfolk for, you know, being, North Norfolk, I'm adding a different part. North Norfolk, who is a doughty champion, raising tens of thousands of pounds for local charities, always passionately going on about his constituency, as am I in Stoke-on-Trent, North Kidsgrove and Talk, which I'm glad to slip in there. And obviously has done fantastic work, and to have the fact he has turned up and listened to his 600 plus constituents who signed that petition, who expected him to be here today to respond, I think is really positive. So finally, Dame Caroline, I think that at the end of the day, I've outlined my position. I think that there is fairness here in expecting in the short term some sort of statutory instrument to be implemented by the Secretary of State. However, I do think a wider strategy is needed, and it cannot just simply be put on the shooter's doorstep. We need to look at forestry, we need to look at the deer population, we need to look, obviously, about the habitat as well. And if we get that right, and the Minister fairly outlined, obviously, the new scheme that's come into play, which I think and has been received positively from one of my local farmers, Councillor Janine Bridges, who is in Great Churn and Patmore, that this is exactly responsible farmers and landowners are taking. And I'm just very grateful to have had the opportunity. And thank you, members, for being here and having the time and space to talk about this important topic.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 619-615 relating to the open season for woodcock. As many as are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. On the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.